I'm particularly thrilled to be here. I've been talking in various parts of the world around what seems to be an emerging interest, not only here in this country, but in other places. So it's nice to bring it back home. And really tonight, it's kind of a provocation to say, let's provoke how we in this country at this time of the year and in this period, in this century, can look at architecture in different ways. Can anybody tell me what this is on the screen here? First one to get it gets a 6-pack of beers. So. Okay, this wasn't part of my presentation, but it's something that I got as recently as yesterday, and I thought I just had to include it in this presentation because it talked a lot about what I'm going to talk about today. This is an image of a site not far away from here in Suikerbosrand, about 30 kilometers south of here, in the 15th century, roundabout. With the current technology, there's a technology called LiDAR, laser technology. Professor Karim Seider, professor of geography at Wits University, has managed to kind of recreate a settlement that existed in the 15th century, just 30 kilometers away from here. So what you're looking at are the traces of human existence in the 15th century in this beautiful environment, which is not far from where we are today. And what was particularly exciting about this for me is that my family, on my mother's side, have a land claim in this precise location. A land claim which was promulgated, I think, beginning of this year. And I had always known from my grandparents when they said to me that, you know, we used to own half of where Johannesburg is. And I would always say, no, come on, you know, really. And I think what's interesting is how technology and the advancement of technology is actually bearing testimony to some of the oral histories that we have in this country. And for me, what's interesting is the kind of relationship between technology and history and the way that these are kind of converging around spatial practices in particular. So that was just an aside. But my talk is provocatively, I named it Black Design Matters. Again, as I said, I'm trying to provoke ways of thinking about design in different ways to what we would normally think about in schools of architecture and indeed in practice. What you see on the right is the catalogue of an exhibition I attended in Australia, in Melbourne, which was really a survey of indigenous designers' contributions to the design world, as a way of trying to, you know, bring into the foreground the contributions that what they call indigenous designers in Australia have contributed. The key instigator for this exhibition was a person called Jeff Greenway, who you see in your image over here. He's an architect of indigenous Australian descent, of Aboriginal descent. He's a founder and contributor to what they call the International Indigenous Design Charter, which I'd never heard of before. So apparently there has been an indigenous design charter which charters how we should work with indigenous people, with indigenous knowledge systems in a way that's respectful and in a way that does not contravene intellectual and property rights. So there is a charter out there which I think would be useful for people to look at if you're interested in this topic. He's an architect by background, and more interestingly, he's a convener of what they call decolonizing the curriculum in Australian architecture, in the Australian architecture field. And obviously, as Professor Finzi have said, that word decolonization gained a lot of traction in terms of how we teach, how we learn, how we practice, and how we view the world in general. So this symposium, I was invited to, I was the keynote speaker for some reason, and was really invited what they called people from First Nations or indigenous people from around the world. So you have Inuits, or the derogatory term Eskimos from the Americas. From the South Americas, there were people from the Mayan culture, the American Indian cultures. From Australasia, there were people from the Maoris, from Australia, and myself, of course, from this part of the world. And the symposium really was part of this search to look at how we might teach in a world that is more about looking at a pre-colonial mindset and whether that can be infused into our teaching today in 2018. So part of the symposium, what he said is to understand the contributions of indigenous people from all over the world across a range of creative endeavors, born by a desire to engage in meaningful ways by embracing and giving visibility to indigenous cultures. So there was the symposium, there was the exhibition, and there were various talks and tours around Australia. So I think what I'll do now, it was an opportunity for me to take a journey and look back at some of my practices and some of the theories and some of the ideas that have informed that practice. And so I'd like to take you on this little journey of trying to retrace my steps as to where I come from, both ancestrally and architecturally. The symposium was called, or the strapline was, "Go back to where you come from." And initially I thought that was a very provocative strapline, especially having known what's been happening in Australia and indeed around the world, around issues of being told to go back to where you come from. And this talks to what we might be seeing today in terms of migration, and what might have happened as far back as 1899 in terms of migration. Indeed, in this country as well, contestations around where you come from, contestations around who belongs where, how did you arrive, by boat or by camel or whatever it is. So I was kind of trying to provoke this idea of what it means to be indigenous, particularly when you come from where we come from here, at the cradle of humankind. As a friend of mine asked, but isn't everybody indigenous somewhere, or somehow? So I went back to look at the term indigenous, its definitions: originating or occurring naturally in a particular place, or being native to a place, belonging in the country in which they are found. These are all Wikipedia definitions. Naturally existing in a place or country rather than arriving from another place. And yet, as I say, my coming from the cradle of humankind, we're all human beings evolved. Ultimately, we're all indigenous to this guy over here, who's our planet. And that's how I was trying to provoke a deeper understanding of this idea of indigeneity, rather than a kind of a contestation of identity politics. As we know, the world was people's kind of, people started emerging from the surface of the earth, somewhere in the Rift Valley of Africa, and gradually over 60,000 years, from 60,000 years ago, started to people the surface of the earth, moving in various directions. So again, the question about indigeneity means that ultimately we are all indigenous to this particular location. So in tracing back where I trace my roots particularly, which is kind of jumping back and forth between the Drakensberg and the Maluti Mountains, depending on which conflict is happening where amongst which clans. What was very interesting in the discussions around where you come from were that this idea that how you are born, the environment that you are born into has a very strong or deep impact on how your brain is wired. And that people who come from mountainous regions have a different spatial intelligence to people who may have been brought up in desert regions or in different kinds of regions. And so in going back, one starts to look at, okay, so this is where I come from, this is how I was brought up in a sense. So how does that impact on maybe a design sensibility or how you might be wired? Related to that is a saying that was part of a speech by our president, Thabo Mbeki, at the time, which says that at times and in fear I've wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship of our country to the leopard and the lion, the elephant and the springbok, the hyena and the black mamba and the pestilent mosquito. So it's kind of like extending the idea of where you belong and who owns, not only to human beings, but to all living animals and living beings in our environment. So this again is, you'll see at the end of the talk, is what I'm trying to get at, is a way of understanding ourselves and our activities beyond purely what human beings do, but to look at ourselves in the context of an environment. And I think this is particularly important because round about 2006, when it was declared that over 50% of human beings are now living in urban environments, what that means is that gradually, in fact now, our built environment is becoming our natural environment, our natural habitat. So if you think of it as human beings coming out of, as biological beings who for the first time now we are building our own natural habitat, it makes it very urgent for us to understand how that habitat impacts on ourselves as human beings. So in this call to extend our understanding of the environment and what we do, the built and natural environment, the idea of citizenship and who owns and who belongs on the earth, one thing which excited me in the conference, which I discovered, was this river in Whanganui River in New Zealand, which earlier this year was awarded personhood. Now what that means is that the river is being given the same rights as a human being would be given. So that river can be represented in court. It's got rights. The guardians of that river, who are the Maori people, have certain obligations to look after the river. You can be charged with grievous bodily harm if you do harm to the river. And this again is a real demonstration of how I think generally as a society we're beginning to understand our place in the world, that it's no more about the dominion of human beings over all things, but that it's more about how we become part of our environment. So going back to the foundations, the earliest settlements, in this case, this is in the mountains of Lesotho, where there's evidence of very early cave paintings, which were done by the Khoisan at the time. And in this journey of mine, of going back to where I came from, when it took me to kind of the cave areas of the Maluti Mountains and the rock art that exists there, as well as the kind of dinosaur footprints, I then went on to kind of look at how would the Khoisan have dealt with this issue of dwelling and inhabitation. And fortunately, I came across a thesis by Dr. Schaba Mape from Wits University, who looked at his PhD on the Khoisan, was called Order, Chaos, Stability, and Flux. And he looked at the role of ritual as a self-induced trauma in the South African hunter-gatherer environmental adaptation. And what his thesis looked at was really how this idea of being at one with the environment was ritually enacted by the Khoisan through all those periods way back. And his thesis covered 5 issues. The idea that despite what we normally believe about nomadic people, the people are generally attached to place, and that their movement is really out of a need to get access to resources. So it's not like it's a natural condition to be a nomad, but that we are all, as human beings, attached to place. And that they had to move as an adaptation to environmental variability. So the climatic data of the time showed that there was climatic change, which meant certain areas ran out of water, and that these bands and clans of people would have to move around in search of resources. And what that did is that it meant that each time they moved, certain people would get left behind, others you'd meet new people along the way. So your society was forming and reforming all the time in response. And therefore there was a need to adapt and reconstruct the boundaries of self. So remember what I said earlier is that in the First Nations peoples, their understanding of self was intimately tied to the environment. So if you're moving from one environment to another one, you almost have to reconstruct yourself. It's not the same person who is in a new environment. And that they therefore had to use ritual as a way of breaking down that self and recreating you in another way, as a way of adapting to this change. And his thesis goes on to talk about perhaps that there might be a need to reconstitute the idea of ritual as a response to contemporary crises. Because the contemporary crisis is one of migration, of movement in response to changing resources, changing fortunes. And that architecture and the environment have a very particular role to play in terms of establishing sites for ritual in the way that you understand how this would be carried out. So the idea of animism becomes very important. Now, animism means when things which are inanimate, like rocks, like trees, are imbued with a certain spirituality. They are made, or we believe that they are alive. And that therefore, if you leave just your traces on a piece of rock, it already gives you a sense of place, because there's a belief that your ancestors exist within the rock, and that the rock is only a veil to another world. Movement, as I said, as an adaptation to environmental variability, and the importance of ritual, the various types of rituals, and the tools that were used in making rituals, some of which are architectural in the kind of primordial sense of architecture. So the trance dance is, again, a way of trying to shift your consciousness in order to adapt from one state to another state. So the rhythmic movements, the sounds, the rattles, women's clapping, etc., all concentrate your state of consciousness, and they begin to move along the intensified trajectory, and eventually you fall into some state of unconsciousness, and then you are recreated in a new self. So people who look at rock paintings understand the meaning of the paintings in terms of what they were trying to convey, and this is where art and spirituality were born. They were born at the same time through a need to enact this ritual and to construct self. So ritual and embodiment becoming important in terms of what we call connection to country, your kind of connection to where your context and connection to where you come from. And I believe this is a very important sensibility to have in order to create the kind of architecture that would resonate in a particular environment. And after having gone through this process of trying to understand what is called an embodied type of architecture, an architecture that we experience not through our eyes, but through our bodies and through ritual and through dance, I came across this book, The Mind in Architecture, which is authored by Juhani Pallasmaa, one of my favorite theorists in architecture. And he actually says the world of art and architecture is fundamentally an animistic world, awakened to life by our intuitions and feelings. So this book, which talks about neuroscience, the advances in neuroscience basically now mean that our emotions and our nervous system can be more accurately understood in terms of how our feelings and our emotions impact on our mental states. And so what is interesting in neuroscience in architecture is that people are beginning to understand better how our environments impact on our mental states, and how, in fact, our environments begin to rewire our brains in a very direct relationship. And that, therefore, as architects and as architecture practitioners, we need to be conscious of the power of environments to impact on people's nervous states. And I think South Africa in particular is a place where we see that almost direct relationship between the environments that have been designed and people have been pushed into, and the kind of mental conditions or psychological conditions that brings out in us. And so there's a real need, I think, for us, particularly in this country, where architecture has been used to kind of create a mental condition or mental reality, which is socially constructed, that we need to kind of untangle and understand that relationship so that we can create societies which are more in harmony with where we want to be. So in terms of neuroscience, and again, when you look at the rituals of the Khoisan, there's some fundamental kind of architectural principles that come out of how our nervous systems experience space. So the idea of containment, which is related to claustrophobia as an extreme level of containment. Verticality, through ritual, we're always made aware of the connection and the force of gravity on ourselves. Balance, again, there's always the question of balance and harmony, which, again, in architecture becomes very important as well. And the forces, the energies that impact on us and that we are aware of through our kind of body experiences. And finally, motion. This comes from Mark Johnson in the same book. So he's saying that these are the fundamental principles of how our bodies experience architecture. Ultimately, if we are to survive as a human species, the idea is that we need to be moving from an ecosystem that places human beings at the center or at the top of the pyramid to an ecosystem where we are seen as just as one part of the totality of the environment. And that, therefore, coming out of both neuroscience, coming out of kind of indigenous knowledge systems, they seem to be converging and agreeing on the same thing. So this kind of shifting implies that we look at a non-Cartesian or non-kind of straight line model of reality. There's a problem with an overemphasis on what's called objectivist paradigms. We try to be rational and objectivist. And that we need to reestablish embodiment and the practice of embodiment. And some of the projects I'll show you now will just talk a little bit about that. So I started looking at other forms of architectural practice that come out of an embodied practice, where dance, for example, is the way that traditional societies create architecture. So when you dance in formation, you're actually making form. and the body becomes what you use to make architecture. And we know very well in our city in Johannesburg here that every weekend we get these beautiful cathedrals, temporary, that are made through disciplined human bodies, and that just are there for the period that they need to be, and then they disappear. Okay, so the next slide, I'll have to move a little bit quicker because of time. A project we did at the Cradle of Humankind. The Cradle of Humankind, as we know, is probably where the birth of consciousness and cognitive ability happened, not far from here. And this project was looking at and trying to imagine, a speculative project, how design would occur in a pre-cognitive world. In other words, a world before we kind of reached that consciousness, prefrontal consciousness, and use purely embodied forms of knowledge. The workshop by Elena Rocky and Dieter Brandt took us on this journey of trying to imagine a way of designing through your body rather than through a kind of a mental construct. It looked at how design up above from a kind of the idea of spirituality, surface movement, how culture is formed on the surface of the earth, and how history is excavated, as you saw right at the beginning in the first slide, below the ground and below the earth's surface. So in this environment, which we're all familiar with, there are various ways of trying to design without using your eyes, so you design and kind of embedding yourself into an environment. These are some of the drawings that she did, imagining Australopithecus and how they would inhabit the environment at the time, and how their falling into the caves gave us the history that we have now. So it's a map of real movement as imagined in the period. Because as she says, drawing and writing are fundamental means of human expression and the cornerstone for the creation, depiction and development of architecture and the ideas that inform it. But really it was looking at other forms of doing what we know as site analysis. So it's like an embodied practice of site analysis, where you try and imbibe the genius loci of a site through non-ocular means. Because we know that in literate societies, where a lot of information we get through our eyes by reading, we have tended to now privilege our eyes over other senses in terms of getting information. And yet, the original condition was that a lot of information we got through our other senses. So could we use our other senses more in a kind of a design process? And these are some of the sketches that I did coming out of that process, from much more intuitive sketches, which then become developed into more architectural impressions and sketches. And finally, when all of these were aggregated together by all the members of the masterclass, Hugh was one of them, it developed what was known as an invisible city. So it's kind of imagining what would be under the Earth's surface if one is using an embodied way of extracting knowledge and of design. And for me, again, looking at this invisible city, which came out of a speculative design process, and then looking at what has recently been unearthed, it's kind of a convergence again, that the technology is actually showing us that indeed there are invisible cities, there are invisible layers beneath the land that we walk on. And whether you use technology of the current day or you use the technology of our ancestors, there's a way in which we can kind of embed ourselves into the context in a much more meaningful way. So I'll take you through quickly a project which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but really just to again highlight this idea that I'm punting, that the idea of going back to a kind of an embodied experience of the environment and of architecture can kind of lead us back to, I think most of us feel that we're a bit lost currently in the world and that we need a reconnection with where we come from. So the project, which you all know, is in Pretoria on the hill, which was once a hill without anything on it. And the task which we were set was, how would we memorialize in an African sense, counter to the kind of Western way of memorializing. And this was a 10-year period of research, of consultation with traditional healers, with anthropologists, faith-based organizations, and what is known as organic intellectuals. And the central thing that came out of both the research I'm talking about now and that consultative process was this idea of animism again, and the idea that as human beings we form part of the environment, we form part of, you know, the trees that we live in already have spirits in them. And therefore we don't need to build things. We don't need to build churches. We already have them around us. So the first act for that project was to plant a tree and plant various trees around the perimeter of the site to kind of establish a connection between the new inhabitants and the site. So again, it's a non-material way of doing architecture in this particular context. The next phase was to really deal with the management of death in African societies. So in African societies where the people have passed on are very important ancestors. We don't worship them, but we revere them. And therefore, when people have died very far away, we need to kind of bring their spirits back. And in this case, this space was made up of soil which was brought from graves of people who had died in various parts of the country during the liberation struggle and who couldn't be brought back. And the rocks which you see there were brought from all the 9 provinces of the country. Each rock was prayed on by interfaith-based communities. And so when the rock arrived, it had already kind of been imbued with that kind of spirituality, which is what animism is about. And so embedded into the architecture is the actual soil that comes from specific locations, is the act of the ritual of praying around these elements. And so already there is kind of an intangible quality that exists in this architecture, which is not just about the form and the shape, etc., but what is spiritually embedded into it. And the plants that we used also have significance in our cultures in terms of how they, for example, if people die in battle, you use a particular tree to bring their spirits back home. And those trees were then planted in this environment. So basically what I'm saying is, I think where we are in this country nowadays, we have such a rich heritage, such a rich trove that we can use in our architecture, particularly to students. We don't have to rely on Arc Daily. We don't have to rely on the glossy magazines, but in terms of finding an architecture that resonates and that will make you famous, we have such a rich heritage and history that this is what we should be, I believe, looking at and unearthing and reinterpreting. Part of the research that I did for this project was to visit some of the traditional healers' sites. This particular site is just outside Vicksburg. And again, what's interesting is that people who normally go there, who are said to be sick, but have a calling from the ancestors, are taken through different healing methods, which again resonate with the original, those ideas around containment, around refuge, around prospect, all those architectural ideas that Johanni Palasma talks about, that traditional healers were kind of enacting. So you sit like on a precipice of a hill and have to sit and meditate there. It's a kind of a way of engaging with the environment at a kind of a big level, or vice versa, that you would be embedded in the caves and have to live there for weeks, again, in order to kind of get communion with your ancestors. And so there's a lot of lessons that can feed our architecture. because the kind of primordial ideas around space, containment, etc., exist both in a neurological understanding of how we respond to environments, as well as in indigenous knowledge systems. And similarly with the museum building, which signified kind of the rolling down of rocks, again, in traditional societies, when there's a crisis in society, normally they say the women would go to the top of the mountain and roll rocks down into the river, and that they would make a huge noise that would call all the village around. So it would kind of signify that there is a need for us to come together. And in the choice of placing this museum, the idea of rocks that have rolled down from the top of the hill, that have been rolled down, became the choice around locating it. And again, looking at indigenous knowledge systems and converting them into contemporary architecture. So, as Finzi had said at the beginning, quite generously, I think I've kind of, through my practice, been struggling with this idea of how we imbue our architecture with a relevance that is about where we are and where we come from, historically, ecologically, environmentally, etc. And maybe in another time I'll talk about some of the other projects. But these projects all ultimately, one tries to kind of unearth the history of the site where you're building, whether it's the history that goes back 60,000 years, or whether it's 5,000 years, or whether it's a current day history. But for me, what's very important is that we are contextual in what we do. And that in order to maintain a competitive edge for a particular place and people, the intention is not to actively strive for a contrived image from outside in, but to discover and express the unexamined dimensions of people and place, which will quite naturally lead to an authentic and persistent identity which radiates from inside out. That for me has been the journey that I continue to take in whatever architecture I'm trying to do. And some central themes that are emerging, the themes around the importance of rocks and boulders, and how when these get eroded, they form space for life. So the dolomite rock in the cradle of humankind is what allowed life to emerge and what allowed life to be sustained. And that can you now start to recreate an architecture that recreates that landscape. This is a house I've built recently, which again tries to talk about recreating landscape, so that this would kind of represent a rocky outcrop, which has been eroded through the action of water and time, and that humans have then found a way to inhabit. So the building is situated on a tight site, which again, constraint allows you to do wonderful things with architecture. When you have wide open spaces, you don't know where to start. But because this is a tight site, with the north being in the wrong direction, the views in the opposite direction, it gives you the stuff that architecture is made of. So you'll see the plan is quite contorted, but around a central courtyard with two wings, and really designed as a kind of a situation, I'd like to call it. So things are not clearly defined in terms of this is where you do that and this is where you do this, except of course where you have services fixed like bathrooms and kitchens. But beyond that, there are various different ways that one can inhabit the space depending on who is inhabiting it. So again, it's almost like it's a found environment that we are inhabiting. And kind of the lessons that I learned in some of the earlier workshops about imagining an environment in a kind of a pre-cognitive era, I tried to bring to bear on this project. So the building is kind of perched on the edge of the landscape, almost as a rocky outcrop, which has a very direct relationship with the environment and, the idea of prospect, that idea of sitting perched on a high hill, being able to look out over the environment, whilst at the same time having refuge and being sheltered, which again goes back to the kind of physiology and psychology of space. And that the kind of various situations that happen in the building that you can kind of flow from one situation to another with a very indeterminate way of inhabiting the space. And then just looking at, again, going back to the caves and how light comes in from cracks from different sides of the building, and how you're made aware of the environment you're in through the passing of the sun, the passing of the seasons. And so you trace the movement of the moon, the movement of the sun, the natural vegetation that exists around it, all in an attempt to kind of say that we are part of the environment that we live in. A lot of fun can be had with playing with shadow and light, and you kind of tell what time of the year it is by when the sun starts to dance on your facade. Okay, again, another project quickly, which was a competition, which was really to design a modern-day infrastructure in an environment that is as old as we can remember. In this case, it's the Okavango Delta in the north of Botswana, and coming up with ideas for developing an airport, which flies people in from Europe straight into this pristine environment. And really the question is, how would you want people to, in the same way that the Khoisan go through rituals to adapt to new environments, what are the kind of rituals that you'd want travelers from, say, overseas, who have to land straight off a jumbo jet into this environment? And therefore the idea was that this project was considered a gateway of where you would change how you are being. There are various ways which I won't go through now of how we looked at dealing with the landscape and reimagining the landscape in terms of the building. It's a very flat, calm landscape, and yet there's a lot of life under the water in the delta, because the delta is full of water, and kind of trying to talk about what we see on the surface and again what happens below. So it's a question of lifting up the delta to allow inhabitation to happen underneath it. So it almost feels like you're entering this under the water environment. And that at airports you don't actually need all the kind of infrastructure and the quality of buildings that are associated with the airport, but what is the minimum that's required to create an airport that has this modern day technology where you're moving from into the environment I talked about. So this idea was that this would be open to the elements, open to the birds, which there's a lot of bird life that would fly through, probably crap on your suitcases, but that's part of the change that one would have to go through in moving from a particular environment into another one. And then, again, emerging trends about the reeds and how the reeds, which are a source of life, begin to permeate the architecture in various different projects. I'll just end off with one of the most difficult projects that I had to do, which was named The Day of Necessity. It was given a cryptic name. And the project brief, which I was given, when I was appointed, was very strange. They said that you'd have to do some enabling works and temporary facilities for an event that we cannot tell you what it is. The program is unknown and will only be determined by an act of God. The location, various sites around the country. Installation, construction period, 12 days. So when we give you the sign, you have 12 days to construct what we need. The impact of what we're doing is probably global. And we were sworn to secrecy, and this was all we were given as our project brief. The status of the project, you cannot tell anybody what you're doing. So this project, this fellow who I'm sure you'd recognize, who had been incarcerated for many years in this country for causing trouble, needed to be interned at some point. And the planning had to happen before that eventuality, because obviously event of this scale could not be, done at an ad hoc basis. So we were told that when it happens, we needed to be ready to plan the internment of this person. And this image became very important, you'll see, as the project unfolds, in dealing with, again, trying to create a temporary architecture that is immersed and imbued with a lot of spirituality and meaning. So obviously the project was about a homecoming, a global individual who was going to be interned at their origins in a small village outside of, in the Eastern Cape, far away from anything, infrastructure, far away from the means to produce things. But probably with the significance that, in terms of the people who would attend, that goes beyond even the country. So again, in trying to look at how do we deal with this project, it's always this thing of returning back to origins, returning back to those who came before us. So we know that in 2013, the event eventually happened. And before that, we went, I think it was a 2-year period of research, talking to family, talking to the various stakeholders around what is the significance and what are the important things what is important in doing something that hasn't been done before. So this is kind of the stuff I used to present to the stakeholders about revealing a process, how we as architects use, rely on, and use, get inspired by whether it's cultural artifacts, whether it's the environment, whether it's the subject matter, to kind of slowly out of that idea for the architecture emerges. So imagine sitting with people who are not familiar with the creative process and trying to explain to them that you can't just arrive at something, but you have to work your way through it. And to give it meaning, it has to come out of something and someone. And that there are physical ways that you can interpret traditional ways of doing things that have meanings to people from different cultures and from different beliefs. And again, the theme of reeds was something that everybody latched onto. Oh yes, we understand that this is how human beings descended on the earth. This is why at funerals our grandmothers sit down on the ground, because they act as conduits to take your spirit from the living earth into the ground. And the importance of, these are seeds which are used in traditional culture. When your baby is born, you kind of wrap these seeds around them to ward off evil spirits. So again, the idea that could we use something that has such significance at birth, probably to use it in this case when you're moving on from one state to another. So what we did was commission an artist, Ujas Sijarim, to work with these, again, ephemeral and organic elements and materials to create the stage set that we wanted to. And Usha, in her manic way, used, I think it was 10 million seeds or something, to create a mosaic of a portrait, which you would have seen on your televisions eventually. This had to be built at a secret location and stored until the eventuality. So the seeds have different colors naturally, And these had to be sorted out into the different colors in order to then be able to make this mosaic and this portrait, a very painstaking process. And of course, the seeds being organic, they can be brittle. So even the environment in which they were kept had to be carefully monitored. And eventually that was the image that flashed on everybody's screens in December of 2013, at the funeral of Utata Mandela. What we had planned for the rest of the stage around the portrait itself was almost to recreate the idea of the traditional hut where a child would be born into, but do it in backwards. So instead of building, a house or a home, you'd actually do it in the reverse. So you carve out the shape of that home by a series of rods that would be hung off the roof, and that could be very quickly then assembled in time for the 12 days that you were given. And so we developed almost like a cutting schedule of all those rods. I think there were 5,635 rods which would be slotted into place, all numbered and named, and all hung off a board that would be suspended from the scaffolding in the event. So this would have then, as I say, created this almost ephemeral way of creating. That was the image we had. And then we had started experimenting with lighting and how lighting bouncing off these rods would kind of create the way traditionally we mark our faces or decorate things. And then, unfortunately, during the process of manufacture, the event of Utata being hospitalized happened, and we were told that we would have to be ready within 12 days, so the whole process was kind of curtailed because people were scared that we would not be ready. And so working with event organizers who work a lot with camera, they came up with ways of kind of cheating the process, but to make it ready for the camera, even if it wasn't ready for the eye. Which again was another lesson for me, because as architects we deal with real things and real environments, and when you're working with camera you can cheat a lot of things. And so a lot of what we had imagined was very quickly kind of laid out with rigging and with kind of fabric and curtains to be in time to be ready for the event. A little bit of a disappointment, because I think the original scheme would have been much more potent from an architectural point of view. But yeah, again, I think the lesson is that we have a lot in our own backyard that we can learn from. And we don't need to seek inspiration from outside. It's all on our shores here.